On a planet locked in eternal ice where no sun ever rises and hope freezes with the wind, a lone alien woman lies dying, lost, abandoned, and moments from her last breath. But just as the cold begins to claim her, a human stranger appears from the storm. What happens next isn't just about survival. It's about trust, connection, and a bond that defies the stars. Stay with us because this is not just a rescue story. It's a story about the warmth we find in the coldest places. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Let's move toward wonderful story. A biting wind moved across the frozen plains, whispering through jagged ice ridges and endless fields of snow. The planet, caught in eternal twilight, knew no sunrise or sunset. Its skies were heavy with low clouds, casting everything in a pale blue glow. Silence ruled here, broken only by the distant cracking of shifting glaciers. Nothing stirred, and to the eye, it seemed like no life could survive such cold. But hidden beneath a shallow drift of snow, a figure lay still, curled in on itself, as if trying to hold on to a final bit of warmth. Her name was Leora. Her skin shimmered faintly, glowing with soft colors that changed between silver and blue. Long, thin patterns ran across her face and arms, almost like starlight trapped beneath her skin. She had once traveled the stars freely, her ship moving between systems like a bird riding the wind. But now, she was broken and lost, far from any known path. Her ship had fallen during a sudden storm that caught her while scanning this planet for signs of life. She had walked for days, searching for shelter, her strength slowly slipping away. Each breath now came as a quiet struggle. The cold was no longer just around her. It was inside her, making her limbs feel heavy and her thoughts slow. Her eyes, once wide and bright, were only half open. Snow clung to her eyelashes. Her fingers had long stopped moving. In her mind, she knew the end was close, but a small part of her still hoped. It held on in silence, waiting for something. Anything. Far off in the distance, a small ship moved slowly over the ice. Inside, a man watched his scanner closely. His name was Taran. He was a human sent by an exploration company to study the planet's surface and gather mineral samples. He had been here for 3 weeks already, working alone in the cold, living inside a small portable shelter that had just enough power to keep him warm and safe. Taran had noticed something strange a few hours ago, an odd signal that didn't match any of the natural readings he had seen before. At first he thought it was a mistake, maybe a reflection or glitch. But when the signal repeated, his curiosity grew. Wrapping himself in thick layers, he stepped outside and began walking toward the source. The snow crunched under his boots, and the wind pulled at his scarf as he pushed forward, holding a small scanner in his gloved hands. The signal grew stronger. Then, after nearly an hour of walking, he saw something unusual, a small dip in the snow and in it a shape. At first, he thought it was a statue or part of a frozen rock, but as he got closer, he saw the shape rise and fall slightly, barely, moving. He hurried forward and dropped to one knee beside the figure. What he saw made him stop for a second. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her features were soft but strange, her skin glowing slightly, her eyes barely open. She looked fragile, almost like ice herself, but she was alive. Taran removed his glove and placed 2 fingers on her neck. There was a weak pulse. She was still holding on. He looked at her face, snow clinging to her cheekbones, and knew he couldn't leave her here. Without speaking, he reached into his pack and pulled out a thermal blanket. Carefully, he wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms. Her body was cold, and he could feel how light she was through all the clothing. Every step back to the ship felt harder with the added weight, but he didn't stop. Inside the shelter, he placed her gently on a padded bench. He started the small heater and adjusted it to full power. The warmth began to push back the cold air. Steam rose from the edges of the blanket as snow melted. Taran moved quickly, grabbing water and a medical kit. He worked in silence, wiping her face, checking for signs of frostbite, and carefully pressing warming packs against her hands and feet. She didn't speak. She couldn't. But when he looked into her half-closed eyes, he saw something there. a faint spark of awareness, as if she knew he had come. Hours passed. He sat near her, watching her chest rise and fall. Once or twice her eyes opened a little more. She looked at him, confused, unsure. He smiled softly, not expecting a smile in return, but offering her peace. When she drifted off again, he kept watching. The strange glowing patterns on her skin seemed to pulse very faintly, like the beat of a distant heart. Taryn didn't know where she was from, or what had brought her to this planet. He didn't even know if she could speak his language, but none of that mattered right now. She was alive and she needed help. And in this frozen, lonely world, she wasn't alone anymore. Leora slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light of the shelter. At first everything was blurry, the world spinning slightly around her. She didn't know where she was. All she could feel was a soft warmth wrapping around her body, and a low humming sound coming from nearby. Her breath came easier now, no longer the painful struggle it had been on the ice. The cold was still in her bones, but it wasn't winning anymore. Her vision cleared enough for her to see the human again. He sat nearby, not facing her, busy with a small machine on the wall. She didn't know his name. She didn't understand the words he had spoken earlier. But he had saved her. That much she knew. Taryn noticed movement and turned around quickly. He smiled when he saw her awake and alert. "You're safe," he said softly, though he didn't expect her to understand. He kept his voice calm, hoping the tone would comfort her even if the words didn't. He knelt beside her and reached out slowly, not wanting to scare her, then gently adjusted the thermal blanket covering her shoulders. She flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Her eyes followed his movements with a tired but curious gaze. He pointed to himself and said, "Taryn." Then, with the same finger, he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows with a question in his expression. She looked at him, puzzled, but after a moment she touched her own chest and softly said, "Leora." Her voice was rough and dry, barely more than a whisper, but he heard it. "Leora," he repeated with a small smile. She nodded, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something soft in her eyes. Recognition. It was a start. Over the next few days, their strange friendship began to grow. Leora was still weak and rested often, but each time she woke, Taryn was there offering water or food, trying to teach her small words. He would hold up a bottle and say water, then gesture for her to repeat. She did, slowly at first, but each time her voice grew a little stronger. When he said warm, pointing to the heater, she followed, smiling slightly as she copied the word. The learning was slow, but steady, and laughter started to fill the quiet space. They shared jokes without understanding each other's language, just through the funny sounds, faces, and small mistakes that made both of them smile. Leora's own way of sharing began when she reached into a pocket of her uniform and pulled out a small round object. It glowed softly in her hand, and when she tapped it, a shimmering image appeared in the air. Taryn watched in amazement as a holographic scene unfolded before him. Tall, glowing trees swayed under twin moons, rivers sparkled in golden light, and strange creatures flew through the sky. It was her home. She pointed to the scene, then to herself, then back again. He understood. This place was where she came from. He stared at the floating vision, awe in his eyes. "Beautiful," he said, even though he knew she didn't understand the word. He looked at her again and placed his hand over his chest. Leora mimicked him, pressing her own hand to her heart. There were no words needed in that moment. Despite their growing bond, life on the frozen planet remained hard. The wind still howled outside the shelter. The supply scanner showed low levels of fresh water nearby, so one morning Taryn prepared to go out and search. He hesitated, looking at Leora, unsure if she was strong enough to come along. But she stood, shaky but determined, and nodded. She didn't want to be left behind. They walked side by side, wrapped in thick layers, the snow crunching beneath their feet. The cold bit at them, but the silence between them was now filled with shared glances and the comfort of each other's. Presence. Taryn showed her how to use a small device to track heat signatures in the snow. Leora picked it up quickly, her mind sharp despite her still healing body. Later, when they returned to the shelter with their supplies, a sudden gust of wind nearly knocked them over. Taryn reached out and caught her just in time, steadying her with his arm. Their eyes met, and for a moment the storm outside faded into the background. There was something new in that look, an understanding deeper than words, built on the days they'd survived together. That night, after they shared a simple meal, Taryn took out a small music player and let it play a quiet tune. Leora listened, fascinated. She hummed softly, and then began to sing a few notes in her own language. Her voice was light, almost like wind chimes, and filled the room with a strange beauty. Taryn listened closely, then tried to mimic the sound. His attempt was clumsy, and she laughed, a clear, sweet sound that warmed the shelter more than any heater ever could. In that frozen world, far from everything they knew, Taryn and Leora had found something unexpected. Not just survival, not just warmth. They had found a connection, something rare and strong, like a fire flickering in the heart of a snowstorm. It didn't matter that they came from different stars. It only mattered that they weren't alone anymore. The days grew longer, or at least they felt that way. On the icy planet where night never ended, time blurred together, but inside the small shelter, something warm and alive was growing. Leora had become stronger. She no longer needed to rest all day. Her steps were steadier, her eyes clearer, and her voice, once soft and uncertain, now carried more confidence. She and Taryn had created a rhythm between them, like two people, learning how to dance without ever having shared a language. There were still many things they could not say to each other, but the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was peaceful. Outside, the stormy planet reminded them daily that survival was not a gift but a struggle. One morning, just as they were finishing their small meal, the power flickered. The lights dimmed, the heater let out a low warning tone, and Taryn's face changed. He stood quickly and checked a panel on the wall, his expression tense. Leora watched him work, sensing the problem even before he explained it. The power source that kept the shelter warm and safe was in trouble. A relay cable buried outside had likely snapped under the pressure of ice. Without it, the heater would fail within hours. Taryn looked over at her and gestured toward the storage locker. He began pulling on layers of clothing, preparing for the cold. Leora stood too. She reached for her gear, ignoring the slight tremble in her hands. He paused and shook his head, clearly not wanting to risk her safety. But she met his gaze and gave a small, firm nod. She was going with him. They stepped into the blizzard, wind pushing against them like an angry ocean. Snow flew in every direction, and even with their visors down, visibility was poor. Still, they pressed on. Taryn held the scanner in one hand, watching its screen as it led them to the power line. Leora stayed close, her eyes sharp despite the weather. Each step was hard, their boots sinking into deep snow, but they didn't turn back. After nearly an hour, they reached the spot. Taryn dropped to his knees and began clearing the snow. His fingers moved quickly as he opened the small service box. Leora helped, holding tools out when he pointed, brushing snow from the inside of the box. The cable was indeed broken, its thick outer layer split and frozen. Taryn worked fast, replacing a section with spare wire he'd brought along. Leora shielded him from the wind, her back to the gusts, her body acting as a wall. By the time the repair was finished, their gloves were stiff with ice and their legs ached from kneeling in the snow. But when the lights on the cable flickered back on, a wave of relief passed between them. Taryn smiled, tired but proud. Leora gave him a thumbs up, a gesture he had taught her days ago, and he laughed softly. Back inside the shelter, they stripped off their heavy gear and wrapped themselves in blankets. The heater hummed steadily again, spreading warmth through the small space. Taryn handed Leora a mug of warm liquid, something like tea, and she accepted it with a grateful smile. They sat in silence for a while, resting, the glow from the power system casting a soft light over the room. Later that night, as the wind howled outside, Taryn took out a small screen and showed Leora a photo. It was of a man and a young boy standing near a river. The boy was Taryn and the man his father. He tapped the screen and said the word Dad. Leora nodded slowly, understanding from his face that it was someone important. He told her a short story, using simple words and gestures about how his father used to teach him how to fix machines and survive in nature. Leora listened, then reached into her own bag. She pulled out a small crystal pendant. Holding it up, she let the light from the heater shine through it. A faint image formed in the air. 2 alien figures standing in front of a glowing blue lake. She touched the taller one, and then touched her own heart. "Family," she said softly. Taryn understood. As the night stretched on, they shared more memories. They sang songs, trying to repeat each other's melodies, laughing when the words came out wrong. At one point, Leora began to hum a soft tune, and Taryn listened closely, eyes closed, letting the sound carry him away from the cold and into something warm and peaceful. Their bond was no longer just about survival. It had become something deeper. They didn't just depend on each other for food, warmth, or safety. They needed each other for comfort, for connection, for the reminder that even in the harshest places, there could still be kindness. There could still be friendship. Taryn looked at Leora as she drifted off to sleep, her breathing steady, her face relaxed. He felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name but didn't need to explain. He knew that whatever happened next, they had changed each other. And in a world where ice ruled everything, they had found something rare and powerful. They had found warmth. The wind had calmed. For the first time in many days, the world outside the shelter was quiet. The sky above the frozen planet, always stuck in twilight, had cleared just enough to show a few stars. Taryn stood outside, his breath visible in the cold air, staring at those tiny lights. Somewhere out there was Earth, his home. But now the word home didn't feel so simple. Behind him, inside the shelter, Leora was sleeping peacefully. He had grown used to her presence, her quiet strength, her soft laugh. In such a short time, she had become part of his world. The silence was broken by a sharp beep from the communications panel. Taryn rushed inside, heart racing. The emergency signal he'd sent weeks ago had finally been answered. A ship was approaching, coordinates locked. Rescue was on the way. Relief swept over him, but it was quickly joined by something else. A weight. A sadness he hadn't expected. He looked over at Leora. She was awake now, watching him. He walked to her, holding up the small display showing the incoming ship. She stared at it for a long time before looking into his eyes. There were no words, but everything was understood. Her people had found her. She was going home. The hours passed slowly. They packed what little they had collected, folding blankets, shutting down equipment. It felt like preparing for the end of something important. Leora moved carefully, touching each object with quiet care, as if memorizing every corner of the shelter. Taryn tried to stay calm, but inside his chest was tight. He didn't know how to say goodbye to someone who had become so much more than a fellow survivor. When the rescue ship broke through the clouds, its lights glowing like a second sunrise, Leora stood beside Taryn at the edge of the clearing. Snow blew softly around them as the large vessel hovered, lowering slowly. Figures in bright suits stepped out, walking toward her. Taryn stepped back, letting her go. But Leora didn't move at first. She turned to him and reached for something inside her coat. It was the crystal pendant she had shown him once before, the one that held the image of her family. She pressed it into his hand. Taryn looked at it, confused, until she gently touched the stone. A new light flickered from inside. This time, a different image appeared. Him and her sitting together, smiling in the glow of the heater. She had added this memory. It wasn't just a goodbye gift. It was a piece of her heart. He swallowed hard, then nodded, pressing the pendant to his chest in silent thanks. She reached out, brushing her hand lightly against his cheek. Then slowly, she turned and walked toward the waiting crew. They greeted her, wrapped her in fresh thermal blankets, and guided her toward the ship. Taryn stood where he was, his arms at his sides, watching as she looked back one final time. Their eyes met. No tears, no dramatic words. Just a look that said everything. She disappeared inside the ship, and moments later it lifted off. The engines hummed quietly, sending soft vibrations through the ground. The ship rose higher and higher, its lights fading into the clouds. He remained there long after the ship vanished, alone again in the cold. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. Something had changed. He looked down, at the pendant in his hand, still glowing faintly with stored memory. Then, as he turned to go back to the shelter, the light blinked twice. Surprised, Taryn held the crystal up. A small image projected from within. Leora's face. She smiled, gently, and spoke a short phrase in her own language. He didn't understand the words, but the feeling was clear. She hadn't just left. She had sent a message. Then another image appeared. A set of coordinates, not far from Earth. A place she would be waiting. His chest tightened again. But this time with hope. She wasn't gone forever. She had left a path, a choice. Taryn stepped back into the shelter and stared at the controls. His mission was almost complete. His data, his samples, his logs, all ready to be transmitted. But something inside him had shifted. The world he came from suddenly felt smaller, less certain. What mattered now wasn't just science or discovery. It was connection. It was the bond between two people from different stars who had shared the same fire, the same fight, the same quiet nights of music and laughter. He walked to the window, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear sky. Somewhere among them, Leora was flying toward her world, but part of her was still here, with him, and part of him had gone with her. In the frozen silence, he felt warmth, not from the heater, not from the blankets, but from within. He smiled to himself, not because the journey had ended, but because it hadn't. It had only changed shape. And as he prepared his small ship to return home, Taryn knew he was not the same man who had landed here weeks ago. He had come looking for minerals, data, and answers. He had found something far more powerful, a reason to keep exploring, a reason to hope, and someone worth finding again.